Hello, Manchester. Welcome once again to Ward 13. I'm your host, Jon Hopwood. My co-host today is Nikki Casey, a political activist, and our very special guest is Rob Werner. He's the director of the League of Conservation Voters in the state of New Hampshire. You're also a member of the Concord City Council, aren't you?
Yes, I co-chair the Energy and Environment Committee.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about climate change and the march coming up in Washington, in New York City. That's Saturday, is it not?
Sunday.
Sunday. That's why we have Nikki here to pass the baton to. I tell you, campaigning, I'm just a rookie campaigning. I'm still getting over the shock and the high. But we have a few announcements to make. And John, can you run the first slides? Saturday, on September 20th at 10 a.m., there's going to be the West Side Community Awareness Rally. This was organized by Bill Barry, who you can see with Senator Shaheen. Can we speed? There he is. John Avard, who's Ward 10's school board member, is going to be there. Also, city departments that are going to be attending the rally, that's the field, the baseball field, the baseball complex. It's going to be held at the West Side Little League Complex, which is on Harvell Street, which is behind the Dairy Queen. And the city departments that are going to be attending include the school department, the Manchester Police Mounted Unit and Community Police Division, the Manchester Fire Department to talk about fire prevention, the Department of Public Works, so any of you who have complaints about potholes or your sewers, you can come out and meet the people that can make things right. The Environmental Protection Division will be there, plus the Manchester Health Department and the Office of Youth Services. Also, there's going to be local family programs attending, the Southern New Hampshire Skating Club, the West Side Little League, the West Raiders Pop Warner Football and Cheerleaders, the Manchester Boys and Girls Club, and McIntyre Ski Area and Disc Golf. Now that's the West Side Community Awareness Rally, this Saturday, from 10 to 1 at the West Side Little League Complex. That's Harvell Street behind the Dairy Queen. And as this was organized by Bill Barry, our great alderman in Ward 10, and it's open to everyone in the city of Manchester. Come on out. There's going to be food and drink, but only while it lasts. Another announcement we have, John, can we go with slides 10 to 14? Okay. That's Joel Elber, and that's Peter White. Those are the Amsterdam boys I was telling you about. We were over at Porta Velata the other day. There's a friend that made Joel and Peter feel welcome. It's the pride of Ward 10 that we have the best Mexican restaurant in New England, I would say. And they are going to have their first anniversary on Sunday, September 21st at 3 p.m. And they're going to have a mariachi band. They're going to have clowns for the family. They're going to have a DJ. And, it's located right at the Mallard Pond, the mall, which is in the area of McDonald's. And it's right near Casey's Rib Shack, right in that complex. And I hate to give up the secret of Porta Velata, but it's the pride of Ward 10 now that we have the best Mexican restaurant in New England, and including Concord, I might add. And
that's debatable.
Also, Friday, September 19th. Can we have the slides 15 and 16? Well, let's go with one that we can get. This is Tim Smith. He's the state rep for Hillsborough District 17. He introduced a bill that was co-written with Lawrence Lessig of Harvard to get campaign finance reform through a limited constitutional convention. Unfortunately, it didn't pass in the New Hampshire General Court, but Vermont passed a version of the bill, and I understand California has passed a version of the bill. There's going to be a Tim Smith fundraiser on Friday, tomorrow. Well, it will be, we air on Friday, so, but hey, if you're watching the show, come over to Strange Brew and meet Tim. Now, Rob Werner.
Yes.
We have a major event coming up, don't we, in New York?
We do. It's going to be huge. It's billed as the largest climate march in history, and there are many buses that are leaving from New Hampshire on Sunday to go down. And I know from being over at UNH earlier this week, doing some work over there, that their environmental club is sending almost 50 students.
50 students.
Along, so.
And the New York Times, they say over 500 buses of people are going to be there, and there might exceed 100,000 people.
They may well. I think it's going to be a big event, big march.
And why do you think that this is going to be? I think it's going to be the biggest event in New York since the nuclear disarmament rally. And I'm of an age, I came of age, Nikki, when the bomb was very much a real thing. And I remember the nuclear disarmament rally. I remember at Boston University, where Howard Zinn was my mentor and my academic advisor, we actually got in trouble by financing a bus to go down there. He was not, John Silber was not amused, if you know that man. He used to run BU with us.
Yes, my wife went to BU, so
Oh,
I'm
okay.
familiar with all of that.
And so would you say that climate change in 2014 is as important as nuclear disarmament was a generation ago?
I would. I think it's a global threat, and because, it has so many aspects to it, climate change, it really has a deep economic impact. It has a national security impact. I mean, the Pentagon earlier this year in its threat assessment documents really spent a good deal of time talking about the strategic threat to the United States that climate change globally represents. Because when you have sea level rise that affects countries, when you have climate change that affects food, that translates to food shortages, it creates instability in the world, which over time can well develop into strategic military threats that we should be paying attention to.
One of the aspects of climate change is water. Water, they say, in another generation is going to be as precious a commodity as oil. And as I was telling you before the show, in Los Angeles, where I used to live, it was 98 degrees at night earlier this week. And the lack of water in Los Angeles is critical. But for the fact that Los Angeles County in 1991 passed very strict water use laws, it would be a debacle of unprecedented proportions. You'd have to go back to like the 1930s and the Dust Bowl. Los Angeles is in a lot of trouble, and it's attributable, I believe, to climate change.
I think that there's a lot to be said about that. I think the science is very compelling.
Yes. Nikki, would you like to ask some questions?
I guess going with the water theme, in terms of places that don't have enough water for the places that do have enough water, now fracking's involved. And all the water coming up is all contaminated. There's going to be no drinking water. People can't even use their tap water without fear of explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think fracking's going to happen in New Hampshire?
I don't think we need to think about that a great deal, because I don't believe that the geology really lends itself to that. We have a very different geology than exists in New York State and Pennsylvania, where there really is a lot of fracking. So I don't see that as a major way to get energy in the future here in New Hampshire, and really very much places in New England.
I think what Nikki is putting her finger on is that climate change is person-made. I'm an editor, and I took the pledge for non-sexist usage. Is human-made. Oh, yes.
That's great.
I lived in California for many years, the Bay Area. But fracking is, not fracking, but climate change is influenced by human beings and their usage of energy and other resources. What do you think about this it's almost a professional class of people that deny not just climate change, but that climate change is caused by human beings.
Well, I think that the science, as I said, is very compelling. Nonetheless, there are folks who do not want to pay attention to that for various reasons. They may be political. They may be tied into the kind of work that we need to do around campaign finance and who funds
oil industry,
Congress, because
industry.
in reality we have a Congress that is
so dirty.
Funded by it's really supported by the funders and not the voters. So I think that has some effect on what gets talked about and what does not get talked about. So backing up though, I think it's I think that, as I said, the science is truly compelling and really zeroes in on carbon as a major cause of climate change and the human activity around carbon and the burning coal and in power plants. And that's one of the reasons why the League of Conservation Voters has spent so much time over the last number of months in New Hampshire really planting the flag, if you will, about what we can do to reduce carbon pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency in June released a very far-reaching proposal to cut carbon, in fact, specifically cut carbon pollution as a proposal by 30% by 2030, based on 2005 emissions as a baseline. And we have spent, as I said, over the last number of months in New Hampshire talking to New Hampshire citizens all over the state in all sorts of venues, up and down the street, up and down Elm Street, for example, here in Manchester, at the Glendy, at various fairs and gatherings around the state, and we collected almost 11,000 comments in support of the EPA proposal in about 2.5 months.
So education is critical.
Education is critical, and what it says to me, and particularly over the last couple of weeks, I've spent time on college campuses all over the state on this issue. There's a lot of concern from all ages, and I think people recognize that we need to do something, we need to act, and there are things that we can do in concrete ways to start going down a different road.
It's interesting, talking about going to college campuses. It's not as if, Nikki, this wasn't talked about and there weren't predictions made. Back in the 70s, I went to BU from 78 to 82. The very scenario that's now playing out, the global warming, was predicted in the 70s. I remember Robert Redford going around to college campuses in the 70s and probably late 70s, early 80s, and talking about this. And it's an interesting thing. In the early 90s, I remember when Bill Clinton was campaigning and others, there was talk about what they'd call the carbon tax. And the European Union, that there was a need to curb carbon emissions to stop, prevent, or retard the predicted climate change. And people don't really understand. I remember I used to write a business when I was in California, and Saudi Arabia, which probably is the most powerful player in the world other than the United States because of its energy industry, actually threatened the European Union that if they imposed a carbon tax, it would retaliate. Because the carbon tax, by cutting the consumption of oil, would have cut their revenues, and they were going to stick it to the EU right up front, and the threat was to wreck their economy. And then suddenly you started to see, with Saudi Arabia, flexing that muscle, suddenly you start to see there seemed to be the political endorsement of policies to limit carbon emissions, and it's just an amazing thing. But now it's 20 years, more than 20 years later, and we're actually seeing what was predicted 20 years ago.
At a faster rate.
Oh, what's going on with the polar ice caps is incredible.
And then the methane from that, isn't that more toxic than CO2, the methane coming out of it?
It can be, but one of the things that came out was information that was released recently is that, for example, here close to home, the Great Bay in New Hampshire, the New England coast is warming faster than was expected. So, for example, and that has implications, serious implications for a city like Portsmouth,
Right.
in terms of sea level rise. Just earlier this week, I organized an event with Portsmouth Mayor Robert Lister and a number of local businesses to highlight the fact that we need to pay attention to things like sea level rise. There needs to be a lot of work done around adaptation, because no matter what we do now, if we were able to reverse trends in carbon pollution, there's enough that has been sort of in the pipeline, so to speak, that sea level rise by a certain number, probably 2 inches, or 2 feet rather, is inevitable.
Yeah.
No matter what we do.
Yeah.
What we don't want to happen is to get to 4 feet sea level rise. So there's a lot of work we can do. You have the adaptation side of it, which people are working on, and there's the mitigation side of it, which is represented by the EPA proposal trying to cut carbon emissions over time.
Right. The people, I think, isn't the fact that the oceans store a tremendous amount of energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's one of the factors of why the polar ice caps are melting and why we'd have sea level rise. It's 75% of the surface of the Earth, but it also is a perfect medium for storing the energy.
Right, and I do think that people are paying more attention. Mayor Lister is in Washington, D.C. today, part of a congressional briefing around sea level rise, and it may well lead next year. It's too early to tell, but it may happen next summer that there's a national meeting in Portsmouth around sea level rise.
Wouldn't that be not?
So more and more people are realizing the work that needs to be done. I think that more and more people are realizing in New Hampshire the effect that it has on our state in a variety of ways, whether it's economic, our wildlife. For example, our moose population is declining. Primarily because of the rise of winter ticks. When you don't have snow on the ground from November until April, the traditional northern New England winter, it provides an opportunity for these ticks to really populate, and because they're not decimated over the winter. And what happens is that these moose are being attacked by these ticks, and we're having a lot of problems.
That's true in the Pacific Northwest. The elk population's under a lot of stress.
And our streams are getting warmer, for example, so that affects trout. So I think, one of the things that, and obviously people want to fish that trout, I think what you're seeing is more and more realization that things like our moose population, the effect on trout, hunting, fishing, that affects people in terms of their cultural traditions and lifestyle, and they're starting to pay attention to that a bit more. Why is this happening? It's primarily, a large part of it is a changing climate. What the implication of that is.
And
go ahead.
Cold water fishing in New Hampshire alone is a $150 million industry. So I think people, when they hear of climate change, they don't take it that seriously, but when it starts to hit your state economically, just think of all the people that come to New Hampshire for foliage.
Right.
That travel industry alone is millions and millions of
the
dollars.
peepers.
Right.
Yeah, so what's going to happen?
Internationally famous for the peepers.
And what's going to happen over time to our ski industry
Yeah.
if we have less snow? What's going to happen over time to our maple sugar industry as we, obviously need certain conditions in March and April to carry out maple syrup production. And if that equation is upset significantly, that's a big impact.
What can you do? Do you go door to door? Do you have staff? Do you have volunteers?
Well, we have a significant staff
out?
Here in New Hampshire that we've built starting in June. And as I said, over the summer, we spent quite a lot of time in neighborhoods, at events, everywhere, all over the state, educating people and getting support for the Environmental Protection Agency, specifically in its clean power plant proposal, which I mentioned previously. And it is, that is a far-reaching proposal that is under consideration.
Yeah.
The comment period has just this week been extended until December 1st. And, there are a lot of ways for people to get involved. We have recruited a lot of volunteers. This will continue on this year. It will continue on through the New Hampshire presidential primary. We want to make sure that these issues remain on the front burner and on people's minds and on candidates' minds as presidential candidates really start to visit here in earnest after this election is over.
They're going to be visiting in earnest on the Republican side, but it seems that Hillary Clinton has the Democratic nomination sewed up.
Boo.
Would you agree, Nikki?
Yes.
No comment from me. I'm the Democratic nominee from Hillsborough District 17.
Well, I can say no to Hillary.
Well, any presidential.
What is Hillary's record on the environment?
She's supportive. She has not come out very forthrightly on most any issues recently, because
How about
she's
Bernie
not a candidate.
Sanders? Is he supportive of the environment?
Very much so.
Yes.
So.
Bernie Sanders is who should
Unfortunately,
be
Bernie's a socialist. He's not a Democrat.
Yeah, I don't.
he might run as a Democrat, though.
I think that really it's an opportunity for candidates of any stripe to pay attention to what constituents are bringing to their own door in terms of what
Yes.
they care about around these issues. Pay attention to the science and come up with solutions that are going to have a effect in terms of making life better for us and getting ahead of this challenge, because it's coming.
Do you think that we're behind on the science? Maybe we have all of
Behind?
the significant science, but are we behind in acting on it, the U.S.?
In acting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
The fact that
so
we are going to have to implement, many municipalities are going to have to implement serious adaptation plans,
Yes.
which are going to cost a lot of money. Make no mistake, if you are going to do things like put sea gates in Portsmouth Harbor, who pays for that?
Right.
Now, whether it's the feds or some cost sharing with the residents of Portsmouth, it's all going to have an economic and cost effect. If we had acted on these issues years ago,
Right.
perhaps we wouldn't have to do as much of this adaptation,
Yep.
for example, as we're going to have to do now.
It seems that the United States, many times, it takes a crisis. Like I said, we were talking about this 30 years ago and a generation ago with Bill Clinton as president. People were talking about this in the United States, Canada, and the EU. And then, because
Well,
of certain
I wouldn't
factors-
confine it to the United States.
I think
Yeah.
it's a
I think it's a human issue.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that our species often doesn't act until the threat becomes imminent, and I
Yeah.
think that's part of the issue in terms of what people are understanding around climate change. I think people are understanding more,
Yes.
and they're looking further ahead. But I think that part of the challenge about it is so many people say, "Oh, yes, I could understand where we might have these changes that are going to take a long time to effect. It may not happen in my lifetime. What does it mean for me personally?" And sometimes when you get into that situation, people don't see an imminent threat to them
Right.
and need to act.
Now, we only have a few minutes left. I'd just like to say about the EPA, as somebody that grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, before the EPA, which came into existence in 1970, they used to dump blood into the Merrimack River. There was a famous book about the history of Manchester called Manchester by the Merrimack, and locals, would make a joke. It should be called Merrimack by the Stink. They used to have the Granite State packing, and it was just atrocious. And the river, the Piscataqua River that I grew up next to, oh my God, it was so polluted. We'd have to throw all the fish back. There was a rendering plant for chickens above. They'd raw sewage. The EPA has been one of the great successes. People talk about the government. The EPA is a great success. Back in the early 90s, my ex and I, we were driving into Los Angeles from the valley, and her father said, "Look, the smog's the smog's okay today." And I'm looking at this cloud of smoke like out of a science fiction movie. So I whispered to Lisa. I said, "What does he mean?" He says, "Oh, you can see some of the buildings. That means that means it's a nice day."
Well, you're right, John. The
we only got
EPA
2 minutes.
has been
Yeah.
a great success. I mean, look back in the 70s, the Clean
Right.
Water Act, the Clean Air Act. All of those laws at that time were passed with significant bipartisan
Right,
participation.
and
Republicans, Democrats together, and we need to revisit that, get back to that, and realize that the earth is precious, and we need to pay attention to what we need to do, and we need to build support on a bipartisan basis to do it.
I'll give you the last minute. Is there something you would like to say to the folks in Manchester?
Sure. There are a lot of things you can do to make sure that your elected officials, elected leaders are held accountable on these issues. They ultimately must listen to the voters. That is how our system works. They need to hear from you. They need to know that these climate change issues and the solutions that are available is a path that we need to move along, and we need to move along it now.
Thank you, Rob Werner, the director of the League of Conservation Voters for the state of New Hampshire. And I'm going to ask other people, like Bob Backus has a show. We could go on for an hour easily. And you need to be, your message needs to get out there. Oh, you should ask him to be on his show. Mm-hmm. And Nikki, thank you very much for being my co-host. And I'd like to say good night to Manchester. Thank you once again for visiting Ward 13. Good night.